Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome again to the Vision Education bite-sized learning videos about the science of literacy. Now remember, as you view these videos and as you go back to them over time, these are developed from our full day workshops and from our in-school work. So they're not expected to be the first time that you've come across this information. They're part of a series. And in the way that we have planned to deliver of these, we are particularly thinking about some of the key principles and practices that we've been sharing with you. For example, the science of learning. And the science of learning tells us, again, that learning is sequential. So our bite-sized learning is around taking a sequential approach to how we provide professional support for you. We know that learning should be cumulative, and so we're going to be building one thing upon the other, as we have illustrated with the ladder or the step analogy to you earlier. We know that the science of learning is built on the principle of teaching and learning being diagnostic. And so we're using feedback from you, we're using questions that you're asking, we're using responses from the surveys and questionnaires we send to you, as well as our work one-to-one and in class to develop these bite-sized learnings to meet your needs. So we're trying to develop that through our approach. And then, of course, we know that teaching and learning using the principles of the science of learning must be explicit. And so with our explicit work, we're using through these bite-sized learning interactions with you, we are building on learning that provides spaced practice, so practice over time. Retrieval practice, so you can go back and you can check and you can remember and think about what you know already and build new learning from that. We're attempting to provide as many concrete examples as we can for you through our bite-sized learning videos. We're also looking at how we can best provide interleaving. So provide examples of interleaving where things are linked together but are spread out over time in a linked and sequential sort of approach. So that we can continue to circle back to previous skills and strategies that we've looked at, and we'll be doing that through our bite-sized learning series as well. And finally, we know that one of the key principles of explicit teaching is dual coding. So we'll be sharing with you not just written material, but visual material and audio material to accompany concrete examples as alongside. So our bite-sized learning series is linked to the principles and practices that we have been sharing with you through our big workshops and our work together, and we are enabling opportunities for you to go back and revisit some of the things that we've learned through this series. So today's is looking at the first of the series, and so we call this bite-sized learning number 1. Okay, that indicates, of course, there's going to be other bite-sized learning things to come, and we look forward to sharing our ideas and thoughts with you. So I'm going to sort of start here with our programs for students, work that we've done together, and help us to understand and think about the science of learning. So we know that the science of learning helps us or is based on helping us to understand how the brain takes in and makes sense of and learns new information. So the science of learning is really understanding how we learn and the various things that help us to learn as well. So when we worked together previously and through our science of literacy teaching tips, we've been helping you to understand the concept of executive functioning. So I'm going to revisit executive functioning with you again in this bite-sized learning video, but remembering that that's really paying attention to our knowledge of, as teachers, of the mental skills that help learners stay focused. And that's us as learners too, isn't it? So it's anyone who's learning something and how do they pay attention? How do we prevent distractions? How do we help them to stay focused? So we're going to revisit that idea with you today. We're also going to have a quick look through some of the work we've shared around cognition and the cognitive processes, the thinking processes, the thinking about thinking and the knowing about thinking and the knowing about learning, that is so important for someone to be able to develop and understand as part of their becoming effective learners themselves, understanding themselves as learners, and being able to self-monitor and self-regulate their own learning. And we will also have a quick look into some of the work we've shared so far around memory and how we help memory to develop by moving from short-term memory to long-term memory. So I'm just going to bring up the slides from the current slide. So I've explained these things to you so far: executive functioning, cognition and cognitive processes, and memory and short-term memory. What I'm going to do next in this quick bite or bite-sized learning is I'm going to now unpack some of the things we've talked about before, some of the things you may have followed with your facilitator in your own inquiry practice, some of the things that you will have read about in our Science of Learning teaching tips, updates, and also in the professional readings that we are sharing with you. So first of all, let's have another look at executive functioning. Now, remember that executive functioning is doing our very best to inhibit distraction for our students so that they learn as well how they can inhibit distraction. So it's 2 points here. One is how we set up our classroom teaching programs so that students have less reliance on or less ability or less need to show and inhibiting distraction behaviours. So we keep them on task, we keep them engaged, we keep them active. So that's the first part of what we've been talking about, how we as teachers focus that in our interactions, in our conversations, in our lesson design, and in how we present material to our conga in our classrooms. The second part of this, of course, is helping students to understand their own learning and behaviours that they themselves can draw on and call on when they feel that they may be becoming distracted. So the first one here is looking at the mental skills that are helping us to stay focused, and that's the general definition that we've provided so far around executive functioning. So we talked about the importance of focused concentration versus daydreaming and distraction. So thinking about how we design our lessons in small pieces, how we stop, how we check, how we monitor their understanding, how we provide, we looked at, say, for example, dual coding, how we provide lessons that use visuals as well as maybe some video or some YouTube, how we provide illustrations, how we provide written and oral support, how we may provide a number of different specially structured concrete examples for students to navigate and investigate. So we're looking at how we set up our lessons to enable students to have focused concentration, not to start to daydream and not to start to wander, their minds to wander. So we know again that keeping the pace of our lessons is really, really important. So it's how we design our lessons and how we think about the pace of our lessons and how we touch base with our students regularly to help them to not become distracted and help them to identify when they start to daydream or when they start to be distracted and what they can do about it. So we're talking about teaching the discipline and perseverance, not to quit. We're not giving up. We're not stopping because we can't do this. We're going to revisit it. We're going to look at it again. So we're going to look at lots of space practice. We're going to go back over time and look at retrieval practice. We're going to use the practices of interleaving so that various things are linked together. We're looking at helping students to understand the concept of selective attention and understand the importance of choosing to pay attention, how they can develop their own cognitive ability as opposed to cognitive inhibition, help them to monitor and self-monitor themselves as learners, and being aware of inhibiting distraction And it's important so that students know that when they lose concentration or they become distracted, they can go back again to understand something. And that's where, of course, our structured literacy principles sit. Spaced retrieval, space practice, retrieval practice, concrete examples, interleaving, dual coding, explicit instruction. So sequential and cumulative learning. So it kind of all comes together, but we've got to be aware of it. We've got to teach being aware of it, and we've got to help our students to become aware of it too. So in bold here are some of the things that you can be looking for. Now, some of these we've included in our tips for structured literacy in the first newsletter that we sent out to you. But this part here focuses on the fact that repetition helps. Choral responses help. So students being active in the lessons and having to respond. None of this passive stuff, keeping them really active, asking them to repeat after you, to ask them a question, to ask a question of each other's, to chorally respond, to respond to a quiz, set a quiz question for someone else, to use their whiteboards, to sketch something or to act something out, to repeat after you, so that they are constantly being engaged in the lesson, to make sure that they're keeping engaged and that the pace of the lesson is helping the students to keep attention to the task and the immediate task at hand. Clearly, the work around formative assessment and going back and checking on learning goals, the prove it strategy where students know what one of the things they are meant to be learning to do in that lesson, and they go back with their buddy and they prove how well they're going over the lesson. All of the self-assessment, the peer assessment, the think, peer, share, compare a strategy where students are engaged in learning talk. These are all things that we can have inside our lessons on a regular basis to help us to make sure that our instruction is focused on inhibiting distraction. And you'll recall from our workshop together that I also gave you examples of how we as teachers can be more aware of that. So the use of sticky notes that we shift around our board with a different activity deliberately to check that we have provided 4 or 5 response opportunities during the course of our 10-minute lesson. Okay, so it's about how we teach. And I think that's a really important thing for us to think about when we're thinking around executive functioning. The next part of our quick reminder chat series today, our Learning Bites, is around cognition. And cognition is around the mental acts, the processes we go through to acquire information. It's linked to knowledge building, of course. It's linked to memory. It's linked to problem solving and how we solve problems. Cognition is linked to comprehension and how we comprehend what we're listening, what we're seeing, and what we're reading and interpreting. It's linked to our ability to reason, and it's most definitely linked to our ability to be able to think about things and make decisions. From our work around cognition, we also know that there is a really important practice and principle and understanding about metacognition. So metacognition comes from the bigger picture of cognition, and it's around us as learners knowing about our learning, knowing what learning is. So in the context of reading, it's around knowing what reading is, knowing the components of reading, knowing the skills of reading that we are learning at the moment, knowing the strategies of learning that we are reading at the moment, being able to explain them to each other. Being able to know and self-monitor when we're not understanding something as well as we could be. Knowing how to think about our learning and be able to articulate what we're learning, how we're learning, and why. So it's around our awareness of our knowledge. And then when we choose to use particular skills and strategies that we have been taught. So very, very strong readers choose to use various word recognition strategies and language comprehension strategies to help them make meaning of text as they read. Those, of course, must be explicitly taught using the structured literacy principles and practices so that all students are able to engage in learning and fully be able to articulate and understand the skills and strategies involved in being strong, confident readers. So if we look to understand metacognition, we also know that there are three types of knowledge. One is knowledge about you have about learning and how you learn. And we're focusing on that at the moment inside our PFS programs. Knowledge about the task and the demands of the task. So we've got students being able to clearly articulate the task. We've got tasks being developed over time, that cumulative and sequential and interleaving practice from our science of learning and our structured literacy principles. That will build knowledge of strategies, when and where and how to use them. That's the part of the puzzle that we have been exploring with you so far. We also know that we can create, through our deliberate intentions and our deliberate teaching, metacognitive learning experiences, experiences through which students learn to use these skills and develop the metacognitive strategies. And alongside that, their ability to regulate, to check, to monitor, to think about thinking, to be able to monitor and prove whether a goal has been met. So we have cognitive load theory, which of course is around how much we can take at one time and take into learning one time. So far, let's recap. We've been looking at in this bite-sized learning, we've been looking at the science of learning. We've been looking at executive functioning, and we've been looking at cognition and metacognition. The third part before we complete this bite-sized learning series with you or session with you is to just have a recap together on this whole concept of short-term memory and working memory. So if we think about memory, it's how we store information and how we use information. So we have our short-term memory and we have our long-term memory. So put very simply, short-term memory is the memory storage that helps us to store information for a short term. It allows us to store it and work with it. It's a little bit like, we use the analogy, a post-it note capacity. But in our minds, in our thinking, we have only so much capacity for short-term learning. Maybe we want to think about short-term learning as what we can hold in our hands at one time. And when our hands get full, we can't hold it anymore. So short-term memory, we can only take so much at one time. And to make our short-term memory transfer to long-term memory, we need lots and lots and lots of practice. So if there's practice and if there's review, so we've got our space practice, we've got our retrieval practice, we've got our ability to use concrete examples, we've got our learning being interleaved over time, and we've got our dual coding principle of, having visual forms and written forms and moving forms and illustrations and pictures and YouTubes and so forth, multiple different ways of presenting information. They are all ways that helps practice new learning, short-term memory, so that it doesn't get forgotten. Okay, if it's not practiced frequently, it can get forgotten. So we need to consolidate short-term memory, what we hold in our hands, because we can't hold everything and we're going to drop it, it's going to fall out, into long-term memory. So our teaching is focused on developing long-term memory. And remember, we shared this illustration, which we found online. It's not an original. But we liked the way that it showed the different components, a bit like a filing system. Long-term memory now being transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory. It's stored and it can be retrieved. It's explicit. It's around knowing that. So it's around facts that you have in your long-term memory. It's implicit. It's the knowing how. and the feelings. It's consolidated information and information that's able to be used. So we can go back and we can retrieve from our long-term memory to help us make sense of new learning. So activating prior knowledge is part of being able to go back into our long-term memory. So we've got our 3 things from our bite-sized learning today. We've been looking at the whole concept of executive functioning, cognition, and memory. So what does this mean for us as we sum up today's quick bite-sized learning? What it means for us is for us to think about, as teachers and as leaders, as literacy leaders and as school leaders, how our instruction really best reflects on what we know about how the brain absorbs and makes sense of new information. Things like linking to prior knowledge, things like providing multiple and varied opportunities to practice something that is new. Things like approaches like spaced retrieval, which is repetition over time. Making sure our teaching is sequential, making sure our teaching is cumulative. Providing scaffolds, providing models, providing active learning opportunities for our students that include think alouds and responses and cognitive supports for new learning. And our Think Alouds are now in the next series of our work and are also, for your information, we're providing more information around the Think Aloud approach in our Tips for Structured Literacy Bulletin 2. So we're thinking about making sure with our students, with our ākonga, with our PFS students, that the practices that we support them with help them to overcome the limitations of working memory, i.e. the short-term memory, so that when they learn new things, we're building that working memory into long-term memory. We're helping them to know how to monitor tasks. We're teaching students how to know. We're teaching them knowing how to do things, how to plan a task, how to initiate a task, and how to monitor, and the importance of practice, review, and revisiting new learning. This, of course, will help us to lead to automaticity so that students are not overloaded. There is not so much new information that they cannot retrain it. So to finish for today, what I would like you to do is just stop and think back about your own target group, your PFS priority learners, and think about individual students that might fit into the profiles that we've talked about sometimes and often, and then think about each of the key big pictures that we've shared today and reflect on your teaching today, your teaching in the last week, and your teaching over the last few weeks, and how you have actually been able to integrate these into your practices. And finally, before we go, think about how you will build further on these in the next few weeks. Kia ora koutou katoa. Have a wonderful day.